Cheers, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Left the Chat. Today, we're going to start discussion on Capital Part 4, which is the production of relative surplus value, which covers a multitude of chapters, but today we're going to cover chapters 12 and 13. So in Part 3, which is the production of absolute surplus value, we learned that surplus labor refers to the labor that produces a value beyond that which is needed for the subsistence of the worker. So in other words, it's that part of the workday that produces surplus value for the capitalist. And surplus value is the excess of value produced by the labor of workers over what they are paid. And so because the capitalists own both the means of production and they employ labor power or own the labor power, the capitalists then get to keep and allocate the surplus value that workers produce. So then in chapter 10, in our last video, we learned about how capitalists try to extend the working day to maximize profit and increase surplus value. So that leads us into part 4, which is the production of relative surplus value. So chapter 12 is called the concept of relative surplus value. And up until now, we've talked about surplus value that has been treated as a constant in the form of absolute surplus value. And that absolute surplus value is created through the extension of the workday. And now Marx presents us with the concept of relative surplus value. He says, I call that surplus value, which is produced by the lengthening of the working day, absolute surplus value. In contrast to this, I call that surplus value which arises from the curtailment of the necessary labor time and from the corresponding alteration in the respective lengths of the two components of the working day, relative surplus value. I'll stop right there in case Steve wants to add anything.
Yeah. So these were actually 12. These 3 chapters are probably some of my favorite that we've read so far.
Yes, we're finally getting into the girth of capital, and I'm starting to enjoy it more.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of it, I think, before probably chapter 10 was really about defining a lot of terms, a lot of concept definitions, which was all necessary, right? To kind of build up this language to understand capital that Marx is trying to do, so that when he starts explaining the concepts that we're going to talk about here, it all starts to really make sense. So, like I said, this was very, very, a good part of the book for me. And like you were kind of alluding to, the premise of this first chapter 12, is basically, he kind of is throwing out the premise of, if you limit the length of the working day, how do these capitalists make money? Meaning, there's only, number one, you have a physical limit to the day, right? There's only 24 hours. But also, there's all these pressures, these social pressures that we talked about in chapter 10, about, society being like, well, we can't work for 12, 14, 15 hours a day. That's insane. We're going to limit you on that. Like, we need time to rest and time to eat and try to do all these other activities that Marx described and that we all know. And, that we obviously don't want to work all the time. We want to do our own thing. So when you have that kind of limit imposed both physically and socially, what does the capitalist do? And the answer to that question is, well, he tries to reduce the value of labor by basically reducing the value of the commodities, right? The value of the commodities that are required to subsist. Mm-hmm. It's a very, very powerful concept. I can elaborate here, but if you want to say anything.
Yeah. Well, just how part of the cost of labor power is, tied to the value of the commodities that laborers need to reproduce themselves, like agriculture, for instance, food, those basic necessities. So therefore, if the productivity rises in those industries that produce the goods that are needed to reproduce workers, then the value of labor power decreases. Right. It's kind of like a conundrum, basically, that Marx is presenting here, and it's kind of part of his dialectical formation, I think, that synthesis is antisynthesis.
Right, and I think it's good that you brought up that definition, of kind of reminding people about what do we mean by the value of labor? Exactly what you said. It's kind of like it's equivalent to this value of a basket of commodities, right? That we all need: shelter, food, water, whatever, clothing. It's a basket that's equivalent to that. Whatever this worker needs to kind of survive and come back to work the next day, that's what's going to be considered the value of labor. And therefore, the whole idea there is, well, if you reduce the basket that they need, right, then you essentially reduce the value of labor, and it's done through this concept, which is now going to be kind of huge for the rest of the book. I think is technological change, right? Mm-hmm. how are capitalists going to reduce the value of commodities? They're going to invest into mechanisms, be they organizational structures or actual pieces of machinery that are going to reduce the time it takes to produce things. So the way I kind of understood it was, if you have a rise in the application of technology, you'll have a subsequent rise in productivity, and therefore then causes a decrease in the value of the commodities, and is an equivalent decrease in the value of labor.
Yeah. So, I mean, Marx kind of, just throughout every chapter, he kind of goes on, and, I wouldn't say he's the best author, I guess. So, because some of his stuff kind of gets a little convoluted, but he gives these little succinct kind of descriptions and summaries in his chapter. So one of those things he says is, in order to make the value of labor power go down, the rise in the productivity of labor must seize upon those branches of industry whose products determine the value of labor power, and consequently either belong to the category of normal means of subsistence or are capable of replacing them. So, like we were kind of saying, if workers need less money to meet their needs because of the commodities that reproduce them, then those capitalists then don't need to spend as much money on the labor power. So if they don't need to lay down as much variable capital, then even if the length of the working day is fixed, say it's an 8-hour workday, then that rate of exploitation still rises as productivity rises. And that's basically the concept of relative surplus value. It's surplus value created by shortening the amount of time necessary to produce the equivalent of the worker's wages. And it's kind of done by two things, which is both decreasing the value of the labor power itself and the tools that the laborers use in the process.
Yeah, and I think another important concept to take from this chapter is kind of like him delving into kind of, I guess, like a almost, I mean, the whole of capital's, I think, mostly dealing at like the macro level, but occasionally he does kind of dive into the micro level. What I mean by that, he starts thinking about, well, what is an individual capitalist thinking at this point? What is he actually going through his mind? Usually Harvey, and we kind of harp on here, like Marx is mostly talking about groups of people, the group of capitalists, the group of laborers, or whatever, usually, right? But occasionally he does talk about the motives behind the behaviors of individual capitalists. And I think this exact section, it's really important because on page 434 and 435, he kind of has this explanation about the idea that an individual capitalist pursues the technological change and productivity to reduce the cost of individual commodities, because if they do that, they essentially, like, I guess an example is like any commodity that they're producing. If they invent a machine, or they purchase a machine that allows them to produce that commodity at much less, right? If throughout the working day, you could only produce 10 shoes throughout that working day, and all of a sudden you can produce 20 shoes in the same amount of time, or better yet, you produce those 10 shoes, but maybe you don't have to put as much input into it. Maybe you invented a machine that just uses leather better, or what have you. You are gaining a competitive advantage for that time period, and that's the whole point. It's like, if I can somehow squeeze just a little bit from the cost of production, I can still sell at the market price, but I'm gaining more because I'm not spending so much on its original production.
Yeah. Harvey, in his companion, gives this example of free trade in the U.S. and how bringing like these cheap imports from China reduces the cost of living in working classes, because especially in the U.S., when you see that, the fact that wages haven't risen much for workers over the past like 4 or 3 decades, it's kind of made more palatable to Americans because the physical quantity of goods that they can acquire has increased, provided they shop at Walmart or something like that. So it kind of ties into like, that goods are cheaper and everything, and they're more affordable, but that doesn't mean that workers still aren't being exploited, for their labor, right?
Right. Like the whole idea there is like, it's great. I mean, I guess, right? I mean, if we've increased productivity, it's great that things are cheaperly made, or we're producing more things, as long as two things I think hold true. One, we're not destroying the planet in the process, right? And two, that everybody is sharing in that productivity gain. If I'm 10 times more productive, but you are still paying me the same amount, and you're reaping all the benefit, well, that's kind of the crux of this whole, of the entirety of capital, essentially, right? He says it at the bottom 435, as productivity increases, cause workers to produce more in less time, but our capitalist still continues to pay as before, only 5 shillings. And it's like, that's my whole point before, is like, if I'm able to produce 20 shoes now in the same amount of time, I'm giving you 10 more shoes than I used to give you. But I'm only getting paid like if I produce 10 shoes in the same amount of time.
Yeah,
so
it's this whole conundrum, that workers are effectively decreasing the value of their labor power by becoming more productive, which on the surface doesn't sound like it makes any sense, and it ends up only benefiting the capitalists, of course, since they're the ones that own the means of production, and therefore allocate the surplus value.
Again, yeah, like it wouldn't matter if we were reducing the value of labor, as long as we're all benefiting from the benefits, or excuse me, benefiting from the productivities, benefiting
Right.
from the changes. But the whole idea is that these gains in productivity are only being captured by a small group of
people. Yeah. Towards the end of the chapter, Marx kind of summarizes the chapter with saying, capital therefore has an imminent drive and a constant tendency towards increasing the productivity of labor in order to cheapen commodities, and by cheapening commodities, to cheapen the worker himself. So that basically kind of summarizes Chapter 12. There's the two concepts of surplus value that we've discussed so far. There's the absolute surplus value and the relative surplus value that this chapter introduces, which again is created by shortening the necessary labor time and therefore increasing surplus labor time. If we think about this in an equation sense, Marx loves his equations. In Chapter 11, we learn about the equation that the rate of surplus value equals surplus labor divided by necessary labor. So in order for the capitalists to increase that surplus labor, and therefore in order to increase surplus value, they need to shorten the necessary labor required to produce a commodity. And that's basically what we've been talking about thus far. And Steve, before I get into this criticism quote by Harvey that I'd like to lay out, is there anything else about Chapter 12 you wanted to say?
No, I think the only thing is that machines are going to figure very heavily, especially I think in chapter not in chapter 13, but definitely like in chapter 14 and definitely in chapter 15, machinery and stuff like that. So I just want to remind people again really quick that machines are considered constant capital. So they can't produce more value because they can only imbue the products that they create with fractions of their original value. They basically depreciate along the time that they exist. They're giving off their value to the commodities that they produce. But there's, like I was alluding to before, the machines are still very powerful because they enable relative surplus. Yeah, they allow these capitalists to capture the things they do because of the fact that if I'm able to produce something that's cheaper and sell at the same price, then I am I'm effectively gaining that money. And this, I believe, does hold true until we have a fully automated society, and we have androids going into the factories instead of humans. But at that point, we're in a completely different sort of society. It's not even capitalism anymore. I don't even know what it would be. Some kind of new form of robo-slavery, right? Or something like that, which is kind of interesting. There's a video game called Detroit Become Human that kind of talks about this kind of problem, how by androids taking over the jobs of people, and it kind of reminded me. I just wanted to remind the audience that we are definitely still aware of the criticisms philosophically of the idea of machines not being able to produce value, but I think it really does hold true until society reaches that point in that thought experiment. But until then, I think Marx's premise is pretty valid.
Yeah, and to that extent, Harvey gives this criticism, kind of a criticism that's brought up a lot about capitalism is people have a better standard of living. They have iPhones and they have certain cars, whatever. So they're not necessarily being exploited, right? Even though the commodities are being cheaper and the value of their labor is being cheapened. So this is a rather long passage. Maybe we'll cut it up a little bit, but this is from Harvey's companion guide, where he kind of brings up that criticism and how it doesn't mean that workers aren't necessarily being exploited. Suppose workers live on bread alone, and the cost of bread is cut in half because of increases in productivity. Suppose that capitalists cut wages by a quarter. They gain the collective form of relative surplus value, thus increasing the general rate of exploitation. But at the same time, the workers can buy more bread and raise their physical standard of living. The general question this poses is, how are gains from increasing productivity shared between the classes? One possible result, which Marx unfortunately neglects to emphasize, is that the physical standard of living of workers can rise, as measured by the material goods, the use values that they can afford, at the same time as the rate of exploitation increases. This is an important point because one of the criticisms frequently heard about Marx is that he believes in a rising rate of exploitation. How can that be? Ask the critics. Workers, at least in the advanced capitalist countries, now have cars and all these consumer goods, so obviously the rate of exploitation cannot be increasing. Are not the workers so much better off? One part of the answer is that it is perfectly feasible, in the terms postulated in Marxist theory, for steady increases to occur in the standard of living of labor at the same time as the rate of exploitation either increases or remains constant. The other part might be to point to the benefits that accrue to one portion of the global working class as a return on imperialist practices of exploitation of the other portion, but that cannot be appealed here. And before I continue, but I'm almost done, he kind of talks there about how, there's the difference between cheap and labor, just like in Asian countries or in South American countries or something like that versus the United States. The labor may be cheaper there, but that doesn't mean, there's still that capitalist exploitation happening in other countries, even though like our standard of living in the United States may be, higher because of that exploitation in other countries.
Yeah, we're living off the exploitation of the global South, essentially.
Yeah. So to wrap it up, he says, I say it was unfortunate that Marx did not emphasize this point, in part because it would have easily forestalled an erroneous, spurious line of theoretical and historical criticism. He then moves on to say, the odd thing about the United States is that it is only in the past 30 years or so that workers have failed to gain from rising productivity. The capitalist class has appropriated almost all the benefits. This lies at the core of what the neoliberal counter-revolution has been about and what distinguishes it from the Keynesian welfare state period, when gains from productivity tended to be shared more evenly between capital and labor. The result has been, as is well documented, a tremendous increase in levels of social inequality in all those countries that have moved down neoliberal lines. In part, this has to do with the balance of class forces and the dynamics of class struggle in different places, while in the United States, cheaper imports and imperialist practices have also helped workers maintain an illusion that perhaps they may be benefiting from capitalist imperialism. But all this lies way beyond what Marx's text is proposing. So that kind of goes into a little more depth past what Marx brings up, but I think it was just important to point that out because that is a general criticism that I hear a lot about how standard of living it may be better under capitalism for people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the rate of exploitation isn't increasing at the same time.
Yep, absolutely.
So moving on to chapter 13, titled Cooperation. This is where, I liked chapter 12, but then this is where, Marx is starting to deal with the various ways that capitalists can procure that relative surplus value. And he talks about, manufacturing, which we'll talk about in chapter 14, but he starts off with cooperation. And that's something, I've heard, and I'll talk about it in this chapter that Richard Wolff brings up a lot about like worker co-ops and the difference then being, and we'll talk about it now, but Marx, gives a historical aspect to how like cooperation has always been prevalent, but it's specifically under capitalism where, the capitalist oversees the cooperation, right? Right,
exactly. I think there was a point there. I think there was always an element of hierarchy, unless we're going back, really, really far back. But I think the crux of this chapter is just, it's kind of like showing how capital corrupted this very good thing, this good concept. Like we should get together and cooperate because we are more productive that way than if I'm out here fishing or trying to hunt this woolly mammoth by myself. If I get me and my, 8 other buddies to go and hunt that woolly mammoth, I'm probably going to be more successful. Or if I'm, trying to build my village, I'm much more successful if I'm able to do it with a couple of people than it's just by myself. So, that's, I don't think is a very foreign concept to anybody. The idea that, the more people you get to help you, the faster you can do things and all sorts of other creative benefits also happen when you have people collaborating and things like that. But it also, is not free from corruption. It's not free from some sort of outside imposing figure coming in to dominate these kinds of modes of organization, we'll call it.
Yeah. So, and he actually brings up the example that you brought up about like hunters, at the beginning of civilization, that they worked cooperatively to capture game, or like in Native American communities with their form of agriculture, that they had to work cooperatively. And like you kind of brought up, he doesn't necessarily talk about these concepts like between whether it's cooperation or the division of labor that we'll talk about in chapter 14. He doesn't necessarily talk about these concepts in a negative light. It's only that they then become negative when it's under the capitalist form of production, right? So yeah.
Right. Exactly. And he kind of also talks about how it started off with guilds, or not, didn't start off with guilds, but like there was a period right before capitalism kind of took off that there was this idea of a workshop and a guild master, or the head master craftsman, and then and then not cast, like he has a journeyman under him and people are learning from this one guy, that kind of thing. So that kind of always existed, and there's a bunch of people cooperating in a workshop. But it was a completely different form of organization, or a completely different mode of production, the kind of like independent craftsman workshop, than what manufacturing is. You know what I mean? And him and Proudhon used to fight about this a lot. A lot of Proudhon's ideas, and I remind the audience, Proudhon was an French anarchist thinker and philosopher and such. But they used to always fight, with each other towards the end, because I think that Proudhon had this whole idea of the going back to the concept of guilds and workshops and things like that, to kind of free society that way. But Marx was like, yeah, but like that's not according to him, that's not really a way to be. You're kind of reducing productivity and just to gain more freedom in a way. So I don't know if that's necessarily the way to go. And like I think Proudhon may not have been as exposed to manufacturing as Marx was in England. At that time, at the 20th century Industrial Revolution, England was like the mecca of manufacturing, which I don't think had made it to all the other countries.
So exactly. Like we talked about before, Marx is a product of his time, and Proudhon obviously came before Marx and influenced Marx, and then Marx was kind of writing based on his observations and his experience in industrialized Europe, right? These next few chapters, 13, 14, and 15, like I said, they deal with how a capitalist can procure that relative surplus value, and the overall focus, I guess, is whatever raises the productivity of labor depends on one, organizational forms, which is cooperation, which we'll talk about in this chapter, divisions of labor, as well as what we'll talk about later on, as well as on machinery and automation, which I guess Marx kind of calls technology, right? Mm-hmm. So Marx's theory of technology / productive forces is machinery plus organizational form, basically. And he examines in chapter 13 how cooperation divisions of labor can be used by capital to increase productivity. And he starts the chapter out by saying, capitalist production only really begins, as we have already seen, when each individual capital simultaneously employs a comparatively large number of workers, and when, as a result, the labor process is carried on an extensive scale and yields relatively large quantities of products. A large number of workers working together at the same time in one place in order to produce the same sort of commodity under the command of the same capitalist constitutes the starting point of capitalist production. So basically he's saying here that the starting point of capitalist production is when you have a bunch of workers under one capitalist, working to create a commodity. And he says that this process of cooperation is when numerous workers work together side by side in accordance with a plan, whether in the same process or in different but connected processes. This form of labor is again called cooperation.
Yeah, like it gets back to the whole idea, one person working 8 hours a day is not as productive as if you got 100 people in the same building, all working together at the same time. Suddenly it becomes an 800-hour work.
Yeah, he says, the quote that you're actually referring to, I believe, is a single person cannot carve a working day of more than, say, 12 hours out of the natural day, but 100 men cooperating can extend the working day to 1,200 hours, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah, because back then it was an 8-hour workday, right? It was a 12-hour workday.
Yeah. I don't think it was until like the 10s or 20s, something like that they, the labor movement and socialists actually, pushed for an 8-hour workday, 40-hour work week.
I remember seeing images of signs that was like 8 hours to work, 8 hours to sleep, 8 hours to do whatever we wish or something.
Yeah. And mind you, at this time when Marx was writing, we were talking about previously in chapter 10 how, child labor was still prevalent. So
yeah, he does go back and kind of just, I think in chapter 15, which we'll get to later, but there I think he starts talking about that again, child labor and utilizing women to push these machines and stuff like that. But yeah, so go ahead.
So like we were talking about that, Marx doesn't necessarily say that cooperation and division of labor are inherently bad things. He actually views them as, potentially creative, beneficial and like gratifying to the worker. And, cooperation and well-organized divisions of labor are, wonderful human capacities. They're kind of like, our human superpower, right? That our collective powers can come together, we're sentient beings and create something out of it, right? He even, like we mentioned, he gives historical context, mentioning, the beginning of human civilization with Indians and, hunters back then, working cooperatively. So like we said, chapter 13, he basically goes on to show how those positive aspects of cooperation are seized on by capital to their own advantage, to the advantage of the capitalists, and thereby turn into something negative for the laborer. And that's because in this mode of production, and we'll go into way more detail in chapter 14 about this, how workers lose their individuality and become like a mass of average laborers as they're like de-skilled, right? And like the value of their labor is
and split up.
de-skilled.
I think another two very important concepts to take away from this chapter is one, I mean, you kind of alluded to this, is that the idea, the foundation, right, of the starting point of manufacture of capital is gathering all these workers in one place, and it becomes a condition. Becomes like a starting condition of production. You can no longer just produce on your own in a small little workshop and be kind of this like petite commodity producer. You're just not going to, it's not going to make it. That's not really going to produce anything of in tremendous amounts. So, number one, having accumulated enough money, enough capital to pay all these workers all these wages and gather them in a single place becomes a condition of production. And two, by kind of orchestrating these massive production lines, the imposition of overseers and superintendents and middle management and things like that becomes almost a necessary part of this mode of production. And that kind of also starts to drive this kind of hierarchy within the workspace, right, in the workshop or in the factory system. Now you got the workers actually doing all the stuff, and then you got a bunch of guys in the middle that are just like making sure people are on time and doing what they're supposed to be doing and telling you what to do and all this stuff, and it creates all sorts of antagonisms between the workers actually doing the work and I should also mention the other workers who are there just kind of like pointing fingers and stuff like that. And then you also then report to even greater workers, the capitalists, who is essentially just, here's money, do all this work for me.
The entire process, obviously, of course, still needs to be like coordinated and overseen by somebody. And in this case, in the case of capitalism, it is the capitalist that oversees production and organizes these workers cooperatively. And that's what's fundamental, like you were saying, it's fundamental for the capitalist mode of production, right? For the capitalist to oversee the cooperative nature of the workers.
It turns cooperation into kind of a form of despotism, into a form of very strict hierarchy. I really want to like drill that home, this concept of hierarchy, because I think people don't really accept hierarchy in like their political life, right? We don't really accept kings and queens and things like that. I mean, but then like we go into work every day, punch at a clock or what have you, and we totally accept it, day in and day out. Well, I got this boss ahead of me, and he's got his boss, and he's got a boss above him, and it's all just like, we just accept it blindly that this is how the structure of power and how decisions are made. It's you become the receiver of decisions instead of an active participant in production. Yeah,
and I mean, I was going to mention something about Richard Wolff. I kind of mentioned him earlier, but it was actually a note that I had for chapter 14. where how he talks about, you know, that the elimination of the hierarchy of like economic hierarchy, right? And like we're, especially in the US, and I mean most industrialized capitalist nations, you know, we value this political democracy, but then when it comes to, you know, workplace democracy, it's kind of thrown out the door, right? There's no workplace democracy. It's more structured hierarchically, like a miniature dictatorship or something.
Right. Yeah, like if I signed up for the military, man, when I didn't, you know what I mean? Like, and it's like, but again, like you said, we just kind of blindly accept the kind of form of hierarchy and power structure in our workplaces, but completely consider it anathema in our political life, such ways, which is crazy. You know, like,
and
that's one of the major barriers that needs to be broken down for people to really come over to the light side.
And to give a quick preview of chapter 14, since you brought up like joining the military, he actually kind of gives an analogy of like the army structuring things compared to like the capitalist mode of production, right? He says like, oh, there's managers and there's different, you know, there's a hierarchy of people giving orders, like you said, pointing fingers down to the people who are just doing simple tasks. So that leads us into chapter 14, the division of labor and manufacture. Join us next time in our next video when we discuss that. Take it easy, guys.
Later.